And with that, we should be able to just open up the solution file. I might already have it open. Yeah, I do. So I'm just going to minimize all this and go into the Visual Studio with the solution file opened. By default, the blank project doesn't have a lot of interesting stuff. It has a few class files here. In fact, it has this giant lame action roguelike game mode base, which actually is pretty empty. It's not all that interesting. So we're not going to be using that today. But it has a few of the boilerplate project classes that Unreal Engine needs. We're not going to really dive into them today. They're not all that interesting. For example, the build.cs file is actually a C# file, and it includes which modules Unreal needs in its build. So we don't really need to touch this. We're not really interested in this now. So I'm gonna just keep them closed, because instead what I want is I want to create a new class. We want to create our first character class. So for that, I'm just going to press F5 to build and launch the editor using our bare bones project. And while that's compiling, I want to quickly explain a little bit about the basic class hierarchy in Unreal. The base class from which everything in Unreal derives is object, or UObject. And I'll explain where that prefix comes from in a second, the U prefix. And then actor derives from that, which is anything that's either placed or spawned in the world. So that can be like a weapon pickup somewhere, or it can be a character or a piece of wall. All those objects are called actors. Then we'll have pawn, which is any object which derives from actor, which is controlled by either players or AI. So they receive some kind of input. And then we have character, which again derives from pawn, which already, and this is very convenient for us, it already implements walking movement. And that's actually quite a lot of code. I think the movement is about 2,000 lines of code or something. So we thankfully don't have to make that. We can just derive from character. And that's what we're going to do today. We're just going to make our own character, and I'll explain what that S prefix comes from in a second. And if you want to know more about the most important classes, you can check out the link in the bottom. So let's just quickly hop over back to our blank project. And I've also reset the whole layout so that it should look exactly the same for you. And the only thing we want to do is just go to File. We go to New C++ class. And we get a bunch of options for us available, and already it's there in the list. Character, that's the one we want to derive from. So we just click next. We have to give it a name. I don't really like my. So the convention with Unreal Engine projects is to have a prefix, like a project-wide prefix. This could be UT if it was Unreal Tournament, or in the case of Fortnite, this will be Fort. That's actually the prefix that they use. We could use S, Stanford, or as U if we want. We just need to have a prefix. And the reason for this is just so that we can very quickly distinguish between a class that is from us, from our game code, or from the engine. That's the important bit, especially if you have some kind of plugins, then they should use a different prefix so that you immediately know, like, that's from that one plugin. Then we click on public. In this case, it's already selected, just so that we have our character class properly in public and private for the header and CPP file. This, for compilation in your game project, doesn't really make a big difference, but it's just the standard. So with this named as character, nothing else really changed. We can just create the class that will add it to our solution file. It will do some regeneration. It will even compile it for us. Let's see, then we're gonna, we'll have to reload. Yes, we wanna stop debugging. Now we have our solution updated, and we have a character, header, and a CPP file. So let's just take a little bit more time and walk through the header. I know that in the first lecture, we really sprinted through all the code and went really, really fast. What do we have here? There's a bunch of boilerplate code that is generated by Unreal Engine for us. So if we just really quickly go over the includes, we have core minimal, which is always going to be included. That is literally the minimum set of includes and types that is required to be working with Unreal. And of course, because we derive from character, we have to include it. And then we have this Unreal include, which is whatever your class name is, .generated.h. This is an extra header file that we luckily never have to open, because if you open it, it will look absolutely terrible. A whole bunch of boilerplate code that we don't have to deal with. We just need to make sure that this include exists. And that's where a lot of the generated stuff from Unreal is hidden. Then if we move down, we'll see a U class. I'll explain this in a second. This is all part of Unreal's, what they call the property system. We'll come back to that in a second. And of course, we have our AS character deriving from a character. And you might wonder, like, what's this prefix doing here? We just created S character, not AS character. This is another one of those things that Unreal adds. It's a one-letter prefix, which is, let me hop over back to the slides. It's a bunch of prefixes that it specifies for us, which are U for anything deriving from U object. That was the basemost class that everything derives from. And then A, if we're deriving from actor. So our character also derives from actor. And also actually actor derives from U object, but it's in the ruling of Unreal, it overrides the prefix, so now it became an A. For structs, we have F. For enums, we have E. And we have for I for interfaces. And we'll come back to this because we'll be making structs, we'll be making enums, and then I'll reiterate on this. And again, there's in the coding standards, there's it's described more. And then in the next line, we have generated body. This is another macro by Unreal Engine. Again, it does a bunch of boilerplate for us that we luckily don't have to worry about. We just have to make sure that that's the first, that will remain on the first line of the class. So what would be an example of something that is a pawn but not a character? Okay. So a vehicle, for example, a vehicle would be a pawn but not a character, because a vehicle would have its own logic for handling movement, but it doesn't have the walking movement per se. It has suspension and there's all kinds of other physical movement implementation. So that would be a pawn, but not a character. And also, for example, flying AI. That would not work with the walking movement. It would need something custom. Okay, so then we just move on. We have our constructor, nothing so special about this. Then we have another unrealism, as Epic likes to call it. It's the begin play function. This is part of actor. It will always be called whenever whenever the level is first loaded. On every actor, it gets called, but also whenever we spawn it. So whenever our character spawns into the world, this function will be called first. Well, it will be called once he's ready and it has been fully loaded, fully initialized. That's the first thing that we can rely on. And then we have the tick function that gets called every frame. And so it also passes along a delta time. This is the amount of seconds that have passed since the last frame, which is going to be probably 16 milliseconds if you're running on 60 FPS, 60 frames per second. And then we have one more function that is the setup player input component function. That is one of the functions we're going to be using today because I want to get started and set up some actual movement mapping for us. But before we do that, I want to actually go back into the editor. We're just going to compile. If you press F5 by default in Visual Studio, it will compile and it will load all of the debug information, which is going to be great if we want to debug. Not so great if we just want to quickly launch, because if you hold Control F5, you won't load the debugger and it will load a lot faster. Also in lecture 5 or 6, we'll go much deeper into the debugging and how to properly handle that with Visual Studio and Unreal. I just want to have one quick note on the begin play versus the constructor. So the constructor gets called basically as soon as the object gets constructed, and then we'll load and we'll do a bunch of stuff. And then only once we're completely ready, everything has been initialized, that's when the begin play is called. So for example, this constructor is even already called in the editor. So I'll show you what I mean with that in a second. But only once we actually start and play the game and it has completely initialized, that's when begin play occurs. So this is where we, for example, want to initialize our variables and we want to create our components, and I'll show you what those components are in a second. But then here, this is maybe where we want to initialize timers. Okay, let's go back into the editor. I want to make sure that we set up our character and we add it to the level so that we have something to play with, even though it's going to be completely barren and won't be able to do anything yet. I already have made this folder. You can just right click on content, create new folder. and I called mine action roguelike. This was a remainder from the prep. And let's right click and create a new blueprint class. Everything, even if we work with C++, you'll still be touching on blueprint. You'll still be extending your C++ classes with blueprint. At the very least, to tweak your variables, but also to assign your content. So for example, we want to, at the end of this class, assign a mesh to our character. We'll do that through this blueprint class. Now, we don't want to derive from character, right? Because we already made our own character, which is called s-character. So we'll type in, you can expand this all classes if it's not already expanded. And we'll search for s-character, and we'll just select that one. And I'm going to call this one player character. And then we can open up that file by double clicking. This is what we get. We have a few components, and I'll show you, and I'll explain in more detail in a second what those components are. But every character is made up of components. So in this case, we have a capsule component, which is going to handle the collision and will be used for the movement. This arrow component is really just to show the direction. This is not going to be any more useful than just showing the direction for us. And then we have a mesh. This is one we'll assign, of course, our actual character to later on. And then we have the character movement. As you can see on the right here, it has a ton of variables to tweak. And that's why it also has those 2,000 lines of code, because there's a lot of functionality that you have to deal with when you make these kind of complex movement systems. But luckily, we just have variables that we can tweak, so that's great. So now we have our character set up that we derive from our own class, but we didn't really do anything custom yet in our own characters. So we don't really have anything that's shown here or anything special that we can tweak. Let's change that by going back into code and actually adding some components, because what I want to do is I want to add a camera. If we don't add a camera, it will already default to the center position. So I can actually show that to you by going back to our level, and I'll just drag this into the world. If we were to play now, we wouldn't really see much, because we'll just start actually with this default pawn that's not really useful. And that's because we have this little player start here. If I move this around a little bit, so you can more clearly see that we spawn actually on the edge and not where we just made our own character. So I'm just going to remove the player start. We're not going to have to worry about this for now. I just want to make sure that we start with this character that we just created. The simplest way to do this, mostly for debugging, honestly, is by setting the auto possess player to player 0. When you have like a fully fleshed out project and you have like custom spawns for your enemies and your own player, you're not really going to be using this, but this is like really useful for getting started with your project. Actually, I also want to save this level because we don't want to re-add this character every time. So I'm just going to save all levels, which will pop up this dialog, and I'm going to save my level in action roguelike maps. Again, you might not have the maps folder yet, or you will definitely not. You can right-click new folder, call it maps, and I'm going to call this test level. We're just going to save that.